He was the son of the most feared man in the world. Yet he died alone, humiliated and discarded, not by his enemies, but by his own father. For decades, his death was whispered about but never fully explained. Some said it was suicide. Others claimed he was executed. But there's one detail they all missed, a single overlooked clue that flips the entire story on its head. This isn't just a tale of war. It's a story about abandonment, betrayal, and how absolute power can turn a father into something far worse. The son Stalin never wanted. Hook, before Yakov ever faced the Nazis, he was already a prisoner of his father's cold indifference. Yakov Dzhugashvili entered the world not with fanfare, but with silence. Born in 1907 to Joseph Stalin and his first wife, Kato Svanidze, he was the child of revolutionaries, born into the firestorm of a collapsing Russian empire. But even in infancy, he was marked by tragedy. Just months after Yakov's birth, Kato died of typhus. Stalin, reportedly devastated at first, would never recover emotionally, or rather, he would never allow himself to feel again. Those closest to him said something inside him snapped after her death. He became cold, hard, distant, and as for Yakov, he was left behind. Instead of raising his son, Stalin placed Yakov with Kato's Georgian relatives in the countryside. While Stalin threw himself into Bolshevik politics and underground movements, his son was raised without a father, a symbol of the sacrifice Stalin claimed to make for the revolution. For the next 14 years, Yakov was barely a whisper in his father's life. Only after Stalin had begun rising through the Bolshevik ranks, following the Russian Revolution, Lenin's declining health, and Stalin's calculated climb to power, did Yakov finally enter his father's world again. He was brought to Moscow not because Stalin missed him, but because the optics demanded it. A man destined to rule needed to appear as a father, not a deserter. But Moscow was no homecoming. Yakov, soft-spoken, Georgian-accented, and shy, found himself a stranger in his father's fortress of paranoia. Stalin, now a key figure in the Soviet regime, viewed sentiment as weakness. And weakness had no place in his world. He refused to let Yakov take the family name, Stalin. He mocked the boy's accent, his academic struggles, his posture. In front of guests and party officials, Stalin would humiliate him, calling him a fool, a failure, even a bastard. One dinner guest later recalled an incident where Yakov tried to contribute to a conversation. Stalin slammed his glass down and said, "Speak only when spoken to. You embarrass even the silence." Yakov's humiliation wasn't private. It was ritual. Desperate to earn his father's approval, Yakov attempted to mold himself into the ideal Soviet son. He studied engineering. He joined political youth organizations. He even attended elite military schools, hoping that serving the USSR would melt some layer of Stalin's frost. But Stalin didn't warm. The rejection ate away at Yakov's self-worth. And in 1928, at just 21 years old, Yakov tried to end his life. He shot himself in the chest with a revolver. The bullet missed his heart. He lived. When Stalin was informed of the suicide attempt, he didn't rush to his son's bedside. He didn't write a letter. He didn't cry. He laughed. "He can't even shoot straight," he reportedly said to his inner circle. The cruelty wasn't just political. It was deeply personal. It was calculated neglect, the kind that carves a hole so deep in a child's heart that no revolution can fill it. And yet, somehow, Yakov kept trying. He married a Jewish woman, Julia Meltzer, against Stalin's wishes. The dictator despised the match and reportedly referred to Julia as that Yid. When Yakov stood his ground, Stalin severed what little thread remained between them. He even had Julia arrested during one of the early purges. Yakov's daughter was labeled the child of an enemy of the people. Every time Yakov reached for love, Stalin turned it into a weapon. And still, Yakov didn't denounce him. He didn't rebel. He tried harder. It's one of the most tragic ironies of this story. The more Stalin hurt him, the more Yakov sought his approval. What kind of man creates such a loop of loyalty and pain? What kind of father trains his own son to believe that love must be earned through suffering? By the time war came knocking in 1941, Yakov was desperate, not just to serve his country, but to finally become the man Stalin might acknowledge. He enlisted. He volunteered for frontline duty. But as you'll see in the next chapter, Stalin wasn't done discarding his son. He was about to send him to die. The soldier Stalin sent to die. Hook. When war broke out, Stalin didn't protect his son. He pushed him into the fire. By the time Hitler's tanks rolled across the Soviet border in June 1941, the USSR was already a state of fear. Stalin had spent years purging the military, wiping out experienced officers, and replacing them with loyalists. Trust was a luxury Stalin didn't believe in. Not in his generals. Not in his people. Not even in his own family. And yet, Yakov still wanted to serve. Maybe he thought war would redeem him. That if he bled for the motherland, Stalin might finally see him not as a mistake, but as a man. He enrolled at the Artillery Academy in Moscow, not by privilege, but by passion. He studied hard, trained harder. His instructors noted he was quiet, determined, almost stoic. His classmates said he wasn't naturally gifted, but he worked twice as hard to make up for it. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, Yakov didn't request a cushy position. He asked to go to the front lines, and Stalin let him. Not only did Stalin approve the request, he made no effort to shield Yakov. He didn't give him a bodyguard or a desk job in Moscow. He didn't even warn him to be cautious. He simply allowed him to walk into the fire. Yakov was deployed to the Western Front, near the town of Vitebsk, a key strategic region that the Germans were racing toward. 4 days, the Red Army was in chaos. The Luftwaffe bombed supply lines. Tanks cut off retreat paths. Soviet soldiers were starving, undersupplied, and outmaneuvered. And then came the moment that would seal Yakov's fate. In late July 1941, during the Battle of Smolensk, Yakov's artillery unit was overrun. Encircled. Cut off. The accounts of what happened next are murky, and that's no accident. Some say Yakov refused to surrender, that he tried to organize a defense but was overwhelmed by German panzers. Others suggest he gave up quickly, that his men were exhausted and he saw no point in resisting. A few even believe Yakov was betrayed by someone in his own unit, handed over to the Nazis like a trophy. But however it happened, Yakov Dzhugashvili became a prisoner of war. And when the Germans learned who he was, their strategy changed instantly. They didn't treat him like an ordinary POW. They treated him like gold. But Yakov didn't realize the greatest danger wasn't being captured. It was what the Nazis planned to do with him next. The propaganda pawn. Hook. The Nazis had Stalin's son in chains, and they saw the perfect opportunity to humiliate the USSR from the inside. For Nazi Germany, this wasn't just a military win. It was psychological gold. They hadn't just captured a Soviet lieutenant. They had captured Stalin's only son. Within days, word spread through the highest ranks of the Wehrmacht. Yakov Dzhugashvili, the blood heir of the most feared man in the East, was in their hands. And Hitler, he saw an opportunity. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, wasted no time. The order went out: use the boy. Use his name. Use his face. They photographed Yakov with his hands up, surrounded by grinning German officers. They had him stand next to captured Red Army equipment. They printed leaflets and dropped them by the thousands over Soviet-held cities and trenches. One leaflet showed Yakov smiling, or at least appearing to smile, under a caption that read, "Even Stalin's own son surrenders. Why should you die for him?" To Soviet soldiers starving on the front lines, it was a devastating message. To Stalin, it was a slap to the face. When his inner circle showed him one of the propaganda leaflets, his reaction was immediate. Cold. Unforgiving. "I have no son in captivity," he said. It wasn't a denial. It was a declaration. From that moment on, Stalin erased Yakov from his mind, and from Soviet history. To admit his son had been captured was to admit weakness. And in Stalin's world, weakness didn't just die. It disappeared. Yakov had crossed a line he didn't even know existed. Not by defecting, not by surrendering, but by surviving. Inside the Nazi mind games, Yakov was moved to a special prison in Berlin, separate from the average POWs. The Germans didn't torture him, at least, not at first. They fed him, clothed him, and kept him alive. Why? Because they had bigger plans. They offered him release, a new identity, a life of safety, if he would denounce his father on camera. They wanted him to record a message condemning Stalin and the Soviet regime, something they could broadcast to shatter morale across the Eastern Front. Yakov refused. Over and over again, he said no. In some bizarre twist of fate, the same man who had been abused, humiliated, and abandoned by his father, still wouldn't betray him. Was it loyalty? Was it fear? Or was it something deeper, a final, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, his father would see this sacrifice and care? But what happened next proved Stalin had no intention of saving him. The trade Stalin refused. Hook, the Nazis offered Stalin a choice, his son's life for one of their own. Stalin's response would chill the world. It was 1943. The tides of war were shifting. The German Sixth Army had just suffered a crushing defeat at Stalingrad, a pivotal moment that changed the course of World War II. In that battle, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, Hitler's top general, had been captured by the Soviets, the highest-ranking German officer to fall into enemy hands. Now, the Nazis had something the Soviets wanted, and the Soviets had something the Nazis wanted. A deal was proposed. Yakov for Paulus. One life for another. Son for general. Blood for battlefield brilliance. It should have been simple. But nothing is simple when Stalin is involved. When the message reached him, it was delivered with caution. Stalin's advisors didn't know how he'd react. Would this crack his iron shell? Would the chance to bring Yakov home spark something human? The silence was long. Then, Stalin reportedly said, "I will not trade a marshal for a lieutenant." But others claim his actual words were colder. "I do not exchange soldiers for traitors." Either way, the meaning was clear. Yakov wasn't worth it. He wasn't just refusing the trade. He was condemning his son. The repercussions at home. Back in Moscow, word of the refusal leaked through whispers in the Kremlin. Yakov's wife, Julia, who had already endured years of scrutiny, was arrested and interrogated again, for no crime other than being associated with Stalin's disgraceful son. She was thrown into the infamous Lubyanka prison, where Stalin's enemies were silenced. For 2 years, she was isolated, questioned, and told nothing about her husband's fate. Their daughter, Galina, was labeled the daughter of a traitor. Even Yakov's memory was being erased. Photographs removed. School records changed. His name vanishing from Soviet military rolls. And still, there was no rescue, no exchange, no hope. Inside his German prison, Yakov waited. Maybe he heard rumors of the offer. Maybe he believed, for a moment, that a miracle was coming. But that miracle never arrived. And soon, Yakov would be transferred to a place where miracles didn't happen. Only torment. Inside the camp. Hook. He survived the front lines. He survived betrayal. But nothing could prepare Yakov for what came next. After Stalin refused the trade, Yakov became a problem the Nazis didn't know how to solve. They couldn't release him. They couldn't execute him outright, not without risking backlash. And they couldn't use him as propaganda anymore. He had refused to break. So they sent him somewhere meant to break everyone. Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Tucked just north of Berlin, Sachsenhausen wasn't a death camp like Auschwitz. It was worse in one specific way. It specialized in psychological disintegration. This was the camp reserved for special prisoners. Political opponents, high-profile defectors, even rogue members of Hitler's inner circle who'd fallen from grace. Every man inside was being erased, not just punished. And now, among them, was the son of Joseph Stalin. The isolation cell. From the moment he arrived, Yakov was isolated. No barracks. No bunkmates. Just a concrete cell. No bed. No light. Prisoners called it the whisper box, because the walls were so close, you could hear your own breathing like it wasn't yours. Every hour of every day was designed to undo his mind. Interrogators rotated in and out, demanding statements, hoping for a crack. Guards would pretend to be other prisoners, trying to trick him into talking. Food was inconsistent. sometimes bread, sometimes rotten meat, sometimes nothing. But perhaps the cruelest detail was this. They gave him access to Nazi newspapers. Day after day, he read about the war. How many were dying? How close the Nazis were to Moscow. And, perhaps most heartbreaking, how Stalin never once mentioned his name. He was no longer a man to his father. He was a ghost. Letters that were never answered. Yakov began writing. Some of these letters were preserved, smuggled out by prisoners who survived the camp. Others were intercepted and lost forever. One letter, in a trembling hand, read, "To Comrade Stalin, Father, I await your orders. If you wish me to remain silent, I will. If you wish me to speak, I will. But I beg you, let my wife know I am alive." He signed it not as a soldier, not as a political prisoner, but as your son, Yakov. There's no record that Stalin ever replied. The other prisoners remember him. Years later, survivors of Sachsenhausen would recall the Russian officer in solitary. They said he paced in silence, never spoke unless spoken to. His face, hollow. His eyes, burning with something hard to define. Pain, perhaps. Or defiance. One Czech prisoner wrote, "He looked like a man keeping himself alive out of spite, as if dying would have given someone else the satisfaction. And yet, it was only a matter of time. Inside Sachsenhausen, no one stayed strong forever." Then came the night of April 14, 1943, the night the guards heard something outside. A spark. A scream. And then, silence. The death that doesn't add up. Hook, April 14, 1943, a body on the fence. But the official story? It never made sense. According to the Nazi report, Yakov Dzhugashvili ran toward the perimeter fence at Sachsenhausen, ignoring the shouts of the guards. He threw himself against the barbed wire, which was electrified. Death came in seconds. His body hung there, scorched and twisted. By morning, it was still visible, displayed for hours, like a grotesque warning to the others. That's the official version. But here's the thing. Nothing about Yakov's death adds up. Why would he suddenly snap? For nearly 2 years, Yakov had endured isolation, psychological pressure, starvation, and the ultimate betrayal from his own father. And yet, he had never cracked. He refused to denounce Stalin. He didn't break under interrogation. He held on to some small flicker of dignity, even while wasting away. So why, after all that time, would he suddenly throw himself into the electric fence, with no trigger, no build-up, no note? Some historians believe he didn't. Was it really suicide? Other prisoners claimed they heard shouting before the death, not the sounds of a man running to his end, but the sounds of a struggle. There are even 2 conflicting Nazi reports on file. One states that Yakov had an argument with a guard minutes before. Another, filed later, simply omits that detail. One document even claims he lunged at a guard, who fired a warning shot, causing Yakov to stumble into the fence. But no bullet was ever recovered, and the story quietly disappeared from German archives. So which is it? A suicide, after 2 years of quiet endurance? A fatal accident, in a camp designed for torture? Or something darker, an execution made to look like a suicide? A political problem. Eliminated. Here's what we know for sure. By 1943, Yakov had lost all propaganda value. He wouldn't denounce Stalin. He refused to collaborate. And the Soviets had made it crystal clear they wouldn't trade for him. So to the Nazis, he was no longer an asset. He was a liability, an unwanted symbol, a broken tool. And the Nazis didn't waste broken tools. More than one historian, including Soviet defectors and German archivists, have proposed the same theory. Yakov didn't kill himself. He was killed, quietly, and dumped on the fence to make it look clean. A body against a fence is a closed case. A gunshot in the cell? That raises questions. A noose in the shower? That invites scandal. But an electric fence? Simple. Neat. Deniable. Stalin's reaction. When Stalin was informed, he didn't ask for details. He didn't request an autopsy. He didn't even want the body returned. One of his commanders later said, "We offered to retrieve the remains." Stalin said, "Leave him where he fell." And that was that. But if Stalin was trying to erase his son's memory, history had other plans. Because years later, something surfaced, a piece of evidence that shouldn't have existed. When Stalin learned the truth, years after Yakov's death, something resurfaced. A document, a voice. And it forced Stalin to face what he never wanted to see. The official narrative was sealed. Yakov was dead. No trade had been made. The war marched on. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Because someone smuggled out his letters. The letters they tried to bury. In the confusion after Germany's collapse, Soviet troops raided abandoned SS offices, intelligence posts, and command centers across Berlin. Among the debris, boxes of files, records, and scattered notes from Sachsenhausen. Some were routine, prisoner lists, supply logs, execution reports. But one Soviet officer found a folder marked with the word Sonderbehandlung, special treatment. Inside were documents relating to prisoner number 147, Yakov Dzhugashvili. Included among them were letters in Yakov's own handwriting. Most were simple, heartbreaking, direct. To Comrade Stalin, Father, I am still loyal. I do not ask for freedom. I ask only for a word. A sign that you remember me. They want me to speak against you. I have not. The final one simply said, "Whatever you choose, I remain your son." No reply had ever been sent. Stalin reads the letters. When these recovered letters made their way up the Soviet chain of command, they were handed, eventually, to Stalin himself. No one knows exactly how he reacted. The room was sealed. No cameras. No notes. But according to his personal guard, Stalin sat silently for several minutes after reading them. Then he said, "Burn them." But they weren't all destroyed. A few Soviet archivists, perhaps sensing history unfolding in front of them, made copies. Quietly. Secretly. For decades, those copies stayed hidden. Buried in off-the-record archives. Unlisted in official indexes. It wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union that they were finally declassified. By then, it was too late for Stalin to deny them. Too late to erase them. The truth that refused to die. The letters are now part of the public record, held in post-Soviet museums, translated by historians, whispered in documentaries. And they reveal something haunting. Yakov never stopped being Stalin's son, even when Stalin stopped being a father. He remained loyal to the man who discarded him, faithful to the idea of a love he never received. His words are not those of a traitor. They're not even the words of a political prisoner. They're the words of a child still waiting for a father to come home. But history has one last twist. Because decades after Yakov's death, another body was discovered. And some began to ask, was the man on the fence even Yakov at all? The body in the wrong grave. The world thought Yakov's story was over, until a grave was opened. And suddenly, nothing made sense. For nearly 60 years, the story of Yakov Dzhugashvili ended at the electrified fence of Sachsenhausen. The Soviet Union collapsed. Stalin's crimes were unearthed. But Yakov, his tale remained sealed in barbed wire and silence. Until 2001. That year, a team of forensic researchers and Russian historians reopened the file on Yakov's death, part of a broader investigation into Soviet war dead buried in Germany. They requested permission to exhume the body buried in the grave marked Y.I. Dzhugashvili. What they found was not just bones. It was confusion. The body that didn't fit. The remains inside the grave were male, yes. Roughly Yakov's age, yes. But several key details didn't match the known records of Yakov's physique or injuries. The dental records didn't align with Yakov's Soviet military file. There were no visible signs of electrocution, no bone burns, no metallic residue. A fracture in the skull suggested blunt force trauma, not consistent with death by electric fence. The official conclusion? Inconclusive. Possibly Yakov. Possibly not. But the doubts were louder than the verdict. Some researchers began to speculate. Was the body staged? Was Yakov killed earlier or elsewhere? Or could he have survived? The whispered theory, the double. There was one theory, long dismissed, but never disproven, that suddenly took on new life. Yakov had a double. During his time in Nazi captivity, it said the Germans used another Soviet POW, with similar facial features, in staged propaganda photos. Some even believed they used this man as a decoy in Sachsenhausen, while Yakov was moved elsewhere. But to where? And why? The theory goes even deeper. That Yakov, broken and disillusioned, agreed to disappear. That he lived out his final years under a new name in East Germany or the USSR, watched, silenced, erased. There's no proof, just fragments, testimonies, hints in unclassified files. But one KGB officer, interviewed anonymously in the 1990s, said, "Stalin buried many truths. Yakov was one of them. The body they buried. Ask not who it was. Ask why they wanted you to believe it was him." The legacy Stalin tried to bury. Today, Yakov Dzhugashvili's name is known again. Not as a traitor, not as a soldier, but as a symbol. A son swallowed by the machinery of his father's paranoia. He was mocked, abandoned, and possibly sacrificed, not by enemies, but by blood. And yet, he never gave up his identity, even when his father did. He was born into revolution, raised in silence, died in shadows. Yakov's story isn't just about war. It's about what power does to family, what ideology does to love, and what happens when a son is forced to prove himself again and again to a man who never wanted him. He died forgotten, but now, 80 years later, the world finally knows what they did to him. If this story stunned you too, this channel is where forgotten truths come alive. Hit subscribe. Comment below. Do you think Yakov was really the man who died at Sachsenhausen? Share this video if you believe stories like Yakov's deserve to be remembered, not erased.